going. She had just turned 42 when her husband handed her a termination letter at the breakfast table. Not across a boardroom, not through a lawyer. At the breakfast table, on a Tuesday morning in February, while the coffee was still brewing, and the snow was coming down soft and steady, outside the kitchen window of the house she had owned before she ever met him. Well, he slid the envelope across the maple wood and said, without looking up from his phone, "Legal says it's cleaner this way." The envelope was cream-colored, heavyweight stock. Her name was printed on the front in the company font. Her name, Margaret Claire Whitfield, on a termination letter for the company that bore her mother's initials in its logo. Margaret picked up the envelope. She turned it over once. She set it back down on the table. She poured her coffee. She sat down. She read it. The letter informed her, in the careful, bloodless language of corporate counsel, that her position as creative director of Whitfield and Associates Design Group was being eliminated, effective 30 days from the date of the letter. It cited organizational restructuring. It cited strategic realignment. It cited in the final paragraph a non-disparagement clause she would need to sign within 14 days to receive her severance. Her severance? From her own company. The coffee was good. She had bought the beans from a roaster in Kensington Market, a small bag, the kind she treated herself to on weeks when things were hard. She had bought them last Thursday, which meant some part of her had already known this was coming. She drank half the cup before she spoke. "Who wrote this?" she asked. Ryan Whitfield, her husband of 6 years, set his phone face down on the table. He had the look he always got when he had rehearsed something and was now performing it. The careful neutrality, the measured regret. "The board voted on Friday," he said. "It was a majority decision." "I know it was a majority decision, Ryan. I built the board. I want to know who wrote the letter." He said a name. It was the name of a lawyer Margaret had recommended hiring 2 years earlier, a detail she noted and set aside. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the mug. She put on her coat, her boots, her scarf, the gray wool one her daughter Nora had given her for Christmas, and she drove to the office. Not to argue, not to cause a scene. She went to pick up the things from her desk that no one else would know to value. A photograph of her mother at a drafting table, the small ceramic bowl Nora had made in a pottery class at age 9, a worn copy of a typography handbook she had carried since design school. She took the things and she put them in a canvas bag, and she walked past reception without speaking, and she got back in her car. She sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes. She did not cry. She called her father. Douglas Whitfield answered on the first ring, the way he always did when his daughter called, because Douglas Whitfield was a man who understood that the most important call you would ever receive was the one you almost didn't pick up. "They did it," Margaret said. A pause. The kind of pause that contains a great deal of restraint. "Are you safe?" "I'm in the parking lot. Come home." She drove to her parents' house in Rosedale, the limestone house she had grown up in, the house where her mother had run the first iteration of what became Whitfield and Associates, from a converted sunroom with 2 drafting tables and a fax machine. The house was warm. Her father made tea. He did not say, "I told you so," because Douglas Whitfield had never once in his life said, "I told you so," though he had earned the right to say it approximately 40 times over the course of Margaret's marriage to Ryan. He said one thing, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, where Margaret had done her homework and learned to read blueprints and watched her mother build something extraordinary from an idea and a willingness to work harder than anyone in the room. "Oh, Liz, they've made a mistake," he said, "that they don't yet understand the size of." Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug. She looked out the window at the February garden, bare and brown and absolutely certain of what it was going to become. "I know," she said. She had always known. Her name, her full name, was Margaret Claire Whitfield, and she had been watching people underestimate her since she was old enough to understand what underestimation looked like. Mother, Patricia Whitfield, had started the firm in 1991 with $12,000, a client list of 3 small businesses, and a philosophy so simple it fit on a single index card that Margaret still had in her desk drawer. Good design makes people feel understood. In 30 years, Patricia had grown Whitfield and Associates into one of the most respected brand strategy and design firms in Toronto, with clients across finance, healthcare, publishing, and hospitality, offices in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, and a reputation built entirely on the quality of the work and the integrity of the people doing it. Patricia had died of a stroke at 67, 18 months into Margaret's marriage to Ryan. She had died quickly, which the doctors said was a mercy, and Margaret agreed with them in the way you agree with things that are true and unbearable simultaneously. She left the company to Margaret, not to the board, not to a trust, to Margaret outright, with a letter attached to the will that said, "You built half of this with me, and you don't fully know it yet. Now go build the rest." Margaret had read that letter, standing in her parents' lawyer's office, with Ryan beside her, and she had felt her mother's hand in it so precisely that she had to look at the chair across the room to convince herself it was empty. Ryan had been supportive in the immediate aftermath. He had been attentive and present, and he had said the right things with the right timing. Margaret had married him 2 years before her mother's death, in a small ceremony at an inn on Prince Edward Island, and in the early years, he had seemed to understand her. The long hours, the exacting standards, the perfectionism that her colleagues called demanding, and her mother had called necessary. He was a marketer, good at his job, broadly competent, comfortable with big rooms and bigger claims. Margaret had brought him into Whitfield and Associates 14 months after they married. Not as a favor, but because the firm was growing faster than its leadership structure could support, and Ryan had skills she genuinely needed. She had given him the Director of Business Development title. She had given him access to client relationships she had spent a decade building. She had given him slowly and without fully tracking it as it happened, a great deal of her professional world. What she had not given him was a seat at the table her mother built. Ryan had spent 5 years quietly, deciding he deserved one anyway. She had not seen it coming with the clarity she should have. She had seen pieces of it. The way he referred to our firm in conversations where she had not spoken yet. The way he positioned himself in client meetings, subtly, incrementally, until he was at the head of the table, and she was presenting from the side. Away. He befriended, one by one, the board members she had appointed, taking them to hockey games and golf weekends, and the kind of relaxed off-site conversations where people say things they would not say in a boardroom. She had noticed. She had raised it, twice, in the careful, private way she raised things with Ryan. Both times he had given her the same answer, delivered with the mildly injured air of a man being accused of something he considered beneath him. "You're describing normal relationship building," he said. "You've always had trouble letting people in, Maggie. This is a you thing." She had absorbed this and moved forward, because she was good at moving forward, and because she believed, in the way you believe things you need to be true, that the marriage she had built was sturdier than her doubts about it. She had been wrong. The affair was not what she had expected. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, someone younger, someone whose presence in Ryan's life would be easy to explain away and easier to miss. What she found instead, on a Wednesday evening in October when she came home early from a client trip to find Ryan's car in the driveway, and another car she didn't recognize parked behind it, was Diane Pressler. Diane Pressler was the firm's new director of strategy, a hire Ryan had championed 6 months earlier. She was Margaret's age, polished, deliberate, the kind of professional who sent handwritten follow-up notes after meetings, and whose opinions in a room always seemed to carry slightly more weight than their content warranted. Margaret had hired her because Ryan's recommendation had been thorough, and the candidate's portfolio was strong. She had noted and filed the quality of enthusiasm Ryan had brought to that particular recommendation. She stood in her own front hallway, in her coat and her scarf, and her rollerboard suitcase from the trip to Calgary, and she listened to the sounds of her own house, and she understood. She did not go upstairs. She went to the kitchen. She took her laptop from the front pocket of her suitcase. She opened it on the kitchen island, and she began to work, not from agitation, but from the same clarity that had always come to her in moments of structural crisis, the same focused precision her mother had recognized when Margaret was 24 and presenting her first rebrand to a skeptical client room. She worked for 2 hours. Then she made herself dinner and ate it and washed the plate and went to bed in the guest room and slept 7 hours. Ryan thought she didn't know. Let him believe that for 4 months. She used those 4 months carefully. She spoke with her father's lawyer, she accessed, for the first time, the full documentation of what she had inherited from her mother. Not just the company shares, but the structure of it all. The shareholder agreements, the IP ownership, the client contract architecture, the real property held by the firm. She had set most of this aside after her mother died, because grief is not a state in which anyone should be making complex legal decisions, and she had trusted that the structure Patricia built was sound. It was sound. It was also, in certain places, more protective than Margaret had realized. Her mother, it turned out, had been paying attention to Ryan long before Margaret had. The IP on Whitfield & Associates' core methodology, the proprietary brand framework that formed the backbone of every major client engagement, was held not by the company, but by a personal holding company in Margaret's name that Patricia had quietly established 7 years before her death. Margaret's name, not the firm's, not the board's, not Ryan's. She also spoke, very carefully, with 3 of the firm's longest-standing clients. Not about Ryan, not about the marriage, about the future of the relationship, the kind of forward-looking conversation that good account stewards have regularly. She listened to what they said. She noted who they said it about. She noted that not one of them, unprompted, mentioned Ryan. They mentioned Margaret. They mentioned Margaret's instincts. They mentioned what Margaret had built. One of them, the head of a major hospital foundation, who had been a Whitfield client since Patricia's time, said something that Margaret wrote down afterward in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. "I always think of this firm as an extension of what your mother started. You carry that. I hope you always know that." She knew it. She was simply making sure she could prove it. When the termination letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, Margaret was not surprised. Oh, she had known it was coming for 6 weeks. She had used those 6 weeks to prepare. She left the parking lot. She drove to Rosedale. She drank her father's tea, and then she got to work. The legal filing was the first thing. Ever. Her lawyer, Catherine Morrow, a woman who had represented Patricia Whitfield for 15 years and radiated the particular calm of someone who has witnessed every variety of professional betrayal and is no longer surprised by any of it, filed an application in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice within 48 hours of the termination letter. The application challenged the board's authority to terminate Margaret's position on the grounds that her role was structurally tied to IP ownership that predated and superseded any board resolution. Catherine also filed, simultaneously, a notice of matrimonial property claim. Ryan received both documents on a Friday afternoon. Margaret knew this because she had a friend, not a spy, simply a friend who worked in the same building as Ryan's new lawyer, who mentioned seeing Ryan in the lobby, looking like a man who had just been handed a document he did not understand and was trying not to show it. The second thing was the audit. Not of the firm's finances, which were already subject to the court proceedings, but of the client relationships. Over the following 3 weeks, Margaret had quiet, private conversations with every significant client account she had personally stewarded over 14 years. She did not ask them to do anything. She simply reminded them, in the way a trusted advisor reminds people, of what their relationship was built on and who had built it. 11 of the firm's top 15 accounts had their primary relationship with Margaret, not with Whitfield & Associates as an institution, and certainly not with Ryan. Margaret did not move those accounts. She did not need to. She simply documented the relationships and let the clients do what clients do when they feel uncertain about institutional continuity. They started asking questions. Ryan's phone, Margaret was told by her lawyer, who was told by his lawyer, began to be a difficult object to look at. The third thing happened because of Beaumont. Beaumont was Margaret's dog. He was a 7-year-old golden retriever with a graying muzzle and a precise, dignified bearing that Margaret had always found genuinely comforting. Ryan had never particularly liked Beaumont, a fact he had expressed not through unkindness, but through consistent indifference. The quiet accumulating message that Beaumont was Margaret's project, and not something that concerned. Margaret left the house following the termination letter. She had taken what mattered: the photograph, the ceramic bowl, the typography handbook. She had also taken Beaumont's leash and water bowl, and the medical bag that held his prescription anti-inflammatory for the hip dysplasia he'd been managing since age 5. She had not taken Beaumont. This was not an oversight. Ryan had told her, through her lawyer, that Beaumont was marital property and subject to the same asset division as everything else, and that if Margaret removed the dog from the property, it would constitute a violation of the status quo order. Her lawyer confirmed this was technically accurate. Margaret did not like it, but she understood it, and she spent the first 2 weeks away from the house, calling Beaumont's veterinarian, Dr. Park at the Midtown Animal Clinic, every 3 days to confirm that his medication was being administered correctly. It was not. Dr. Park, who had been Beaumont's vet since he was a puppy, and who kept Margaret updated with the professional discretion of someone who cared more about the patient than the politics, told Margaret on a Thursday in March that Beaumont had missed 2 medication appointments, and that whoever was managing his care had not been refilling the prescription on schedule. Margaret hung up the phone and called her lawyer and said, in a tone Catherine Morrow later described as very quiet and very clear, "I need Beaumont out of that house by Monday." The order was obtained on a Friday. Margaret picked up Beaumont from Dr. Park's clinic on a Saturday morning. He walked out to her car with the particular gait of a dog who has been managing discomfort without complaint, and when she opened the back door he climbed in slowly and carefully, and then put his gray muzzle on her shoulder from the back seat, and Margaret sat in the parking lot of the veterinary clinic, with her hand on his ear and felt, for the first time in months, like the ground beneath her was solid. She got him home. She gave him his medication. She made him a bed from the blanket her mother had kept on the sofa in the sunroom office, a blanket that still smelled, if you pressed your face into it, of the particular combination of coffee and pencil shavings that had meant mother working for as long as Margaret could remember. Beaumont slept on it for 14 hours. Ryan had believed, with the completeness of a man who had never had to take inventory of his assumptions, that he understood what he was taking. He had looked at Margaret's life and seen a company. He had seen a client roster and an office lease and a design team and a reputation built on 30 years of Whitfield family work. He had sat in her mother's boardroom and believed, incrementally, that it was becoming his boardroom. He had watched Margaret run the infrastructure of their marriage, the house, the meals, the social calendar, the dinner parties for the client relationships that kept his business development role relevant, and he had called this, internally, the domestic side of things. Separate from what mattered, separate from what he was building. He had not understood that the dinner parties were strategy. He had not understood that the ease with which clients spoke to him was a product of proximity to Margaret, not a quality of his own. He had not understood that the firm's reputation, which he had been borrowing for 5 years, was not transferable. It was personal. It was hers. Diane Pressler understood this faster than Ryan did. She had been in the room for enough client conversations to recognize where the warmth in those rooms was directed, and it was not directed at Ryan. By the time the court proceedings began generating the kind of industry gossip that Toronto's professional community runs entirely on, Diane had begun to consider her own position with some care. She left Whitfield & Associates in April. She gave 2 weeks' notice in an email that cited personal reasons and thanked the team for the experience. She did not send a separate email to Ryan. Margaret heard about this from 3 different people in the same afternoon, which was how she knew it was real and not rumor. Ryan found out about Diane's departure the same way he found out about most things that had been happening around him for months. After the fact, alone, in a house that had been running on someone else's systems and was now failing in the specific, unglamorous ways that houses fail when no one capable is maintaining them. Otomy, the service company that had managed the bi-weekly cleaning, had been on Margaret's account. The property taxes were on autodraft from an account Margaret had closed as part of the asset separation. The carbon monoxide detector in the upstairs hallway had been running on a battery since October, and Margaret was the only one who had known that and replaced it annually. Ryan discovered the battery issue when the alarm went off at 2 a.m. in mid-March, and he spent 40 minutes searching for the source before calling a neighbor. The neighbor, an older woman named Patricia, who had been friends with Margaret's mother for 20 years, helped him locate the detector. She did not say anything unkind. She simply handed him a 9-volt battery from the kitchen drawer she had pointed him toward. The same drawer where Margaret had kept all the batteries, organized by type, in a divided container she had bought at the hardware store on Yonge Street the first winter they lived in the house. Margaret always took care of this kind of thing, Patricia said, in the tone of a woman observing a fact. Ryan said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. The gala had been Ryan's initiative. This was important, because it meant the disaster was entirely of his own construction. He had proposed it to the board in late January, before the legal proceedings had clarified the full picture for everyone involved. He had proposed a fundraising dinner for Sick Kids Foundation, a charity Whitfield and Associates had supported for years, and he had proposed it with the stated goal of signaling stability and community commitment during a period of transition. The board had approved it. Ryan had arranged a venue, a ballroom at a hotel on King Street, for a May evening. He had put the Whitfield and Associates name on the invitations. He had invited 200 people from the firm's professional and social network. He had not thought carefully about who those people's relationships were with. Margaret heard about the gala from Catherine, who heard about it from the foundation's executive director, who called to ask, with appropriate delicacy, whether Margaret planned to attend. Given that the foundation's longest and largest ongoing relationship had always been with Margaret personally, and with her mother before that. Margaret considered this for approximately 12 seconds. She called the foundation's director herself that afternoon. They spoke for 40 minutes. At the end of the conversation, the director mentioned that the foundation had been hoping to announce a significant new endowment gift at the gala. "I'd like to make that gift," Margaret said. There was a pause. "In your name?" the director asked. "In my mother's name," Margaret said. "The Patricia Ann Whitfield Endowment for Pediatric Design Research. My mother believed good design was a healthcare issue. I'd like to make that permanent." She arrived at the gala at 7:45, not dramatically. She did not make an entrance. She walked through the lobby of the hotel in a dark green dress that her mother had always said was the color of serious women, and she gave her coat to the attendant, and she walked into the ballroom at the pace of a woman who has nowhere more important to be and is not hurrying. The room was full of people who knew her, or, precisely, it was full of people who knew her better than they knew Ryan, and who had, over the preceding 3 months, been quietly recalibrating their understanding of what was happening at Whitfield and Associates and what it meant for their own relationships with the firm. She saw Ryan at the head table. He saw her at the same moment. She watched his face perform the same sequence she had seen on the morning of the termination letter. The rehearsed neutrality, the managed expression, and she watched it fail. Because this room was not a kitchen table, and there was no script that covered this particular situation. She was seated, she discovered, at the head table also, beside the foundation director, across from the board chair she had appointed 9 years ago, who stood when she approached and said her name with the warmth of a man who had been doing a considerable amount of private reassessment. The foundation director introduced Margaret from the podium at 8:15. She read the details of the endowment. She used Patricia Whitfield's name 5 times. She used the word legacy twice and the word vision 3 times, and every time she said any of these words, the room understood who they were about and who had made them possible. Margaret spoke for 6 minutes. She spoke about her mother, and about design, and about what it means to build something that outlasts you. She spoke about the nurses and the child life specialists, and the unit coordinators at Sick Kids, who managed complex, terrifying situations with steady hands and clear heads, and went home at the end of a shift to manage households and families, and came back the next morning, and did it again, and were called, by the people who benefited from this work, simply good at their jobs. She did not say Ryan's name. She did not look at him while she spoke. She did not need to. Every person in the room who understood the context, and most of them did, was doing the translation themselves. When she sat down, Ryan leaned toward her. His voice was low, careful, performing the tone of a man who was being reasonable. "Maggie, I didn't know it would go this far. I thought." She turned her head slightly toward him, not fully, the way you turn toward a sound you are deciding whether to address. "You thought I would leave quietly," she said. Because I had always been quiet." He started to say something. "The difference," she said, not raising her voice, "between quiet and contained is significant. You should have asked which one I was. You had 6 years." She turned back to the room. She did not speak to him again that evening. The months that followed settled into a shape that Margaret had not planned but recognized, the natural consequences of structure rather than strategy. The board, reviewing its position with the benefit of legal counsel, and the deteriorating state of the firm's client relationships, reached out to Catherine Morrow in June to discuss terms. The conversation was brief. The terms were Margaret's terms, principally, because the alternative, which was to litigate a case that would require the board to argue it had the authority to terminate someone who owned the intellectual property the firm's entire methodology was built on, was not a case any of their lawyers wanted to take to trial. Ryan left the firm in July. He negotiated his own exit package. Margaret did not involve herself in the specifics. She had, by that point, more important things to spend her attention on. The divorce was finalized in September, 17 months after the morning at the breakfast table. The settlement was what the settlement was. Margaret had not gone in seeking punishment. She had gone in seeking clarity, the clean accounting of what belonged to whom, the kind of structural honesty that the marriage had not managed to produce on its own. She got the house. She had bought it before the marriage, and her lawyer had been thorough. She got Beaumont, by then 11 years old, moving more slowly, graying further, as serene and dignified as ever. She got the company back, fully, in the form it had always actually been in, hers. On the first morning of October, Margaret drove to the office. She parked in the spot that had always been hers. She took the elevator to the 4th floor, walked past the reception desk, where the young woman who had started 6 months before the termination letter, and had throughout all of it, continued to do her job with admirable consistency, looked up and said good morning, as though no time had passed at all. Margaret said good morning back. She unlocked her office. She set down her bag. She hung her coat on the hook behind the door. She took the photograph of her mother from the canvas bag she had been carrying it in and set it back on the desk where it had lived for 14 years, facing the window, facing the skyline, facing forward. She put the ceramic bowl beside it. She put the typography handbook on the shelf. She sat down at her desk. Beaumont was at her parents' house for the day, in the care of Douglas Whitfield, who had recently discovered, at age 76, that a large elderly dog was an excellent reason to take a slow morning walk, and had become very attached to this discovery. Margaret had called before she left home. Her father had answered on the first ring. "He's had his medication and half a piece of my toast," Douglas said. "He's fine. Go do your work." She opened her laptop. She read the overnight emails. She made a list of what needed attention, in order of what mattered. She had spent 6 years managing everything, and being seen managing nothing. She had spent 17 months dismantling what had been built on top of her without her permission. She was 42 years old, and she was sitting at her mother's desk in her mother's firm, which was her firm, which was simply itself again. The work, the clients, the design, the belief that built it. October in Toronto was doing what it always did, making the city look like it was catching fire in the best possible way, red and gold, and impossibly bright against a sky so blue it seemed implausible. Margaret looked at it for a moment. Just a moment. Then she turned back to her work. Somewhere, on the other side of the city, in a house that was no longer his, Ryan was learning what she had always known. That a life built on someone else's architecture does not survive their departure. That the systems that looked like background, the calendar, the relationship management, the steady maintenance of everything that allowed ambition to function, were never background. They were the building. And the building had walked out and taken its foundations with it. She did not think about Ryan often. When she did, it was not with anger, which had served its season, or with grief, which had done the same. It was with the flat, clear recognition of a woman who had performed a very thorough audit and found the numbers to be exactly what they were. She had built a company with her mother. She had loved a man who looked at that company and saw something to climb. She had been quiet about who she was, for longer than she should have been, because silence had felt like safety for so long that she had confused it with wisdom. She was not silent now. She opened the first file. She read the first line. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes only after you have lost everything that was never actually yours to begin with. It is not the freedom of escape. It is the freedom of accuracy. The clean, structural relief of a life that now reflects, in every room and every relationship and every morning you walk into your own office, exactly who you are and what you built and what you intend to build next. Margaret had always been the quietest person in rooms that were loud with people taking credit for her work. Now the room was hers. She had always known the difference between quiet and finished. Now, so did everyone else.